Well, it's good to be back with you after a couple of weeks away, and I've come up a little lame the last few days because I've been, actually over the last 2 weeks, been taking care of other people, and so I've been lifting a lot of folks, and my grandbaby, my dog, and my wife, who's not doing quite very well, so I would ask you to pray for Joan. She's really kind of in a bad spot. So at any rate, it's sort of resulted in this. So I'm going to use this really to kind of keep the compression off of my back here. At any rate, our first reading was from the Proverbs, and it's not frequent that we actually have anything from the Proverbs. And so we have that today, and when you think of the Proverbs, you think of these little pithy sayings, and there are chapters of those, but really at the beginning of the book and the end of the book, there's really a case that's being made, apart from these pithy Proverbs, of the importance of wisdom, of being a person who is wise, and contrasting that with people that are foolish, that make poor decisions or not thoughtful decisions, or things that are contrary to the purposes of God's universe. And because what we want to find is find the spine of that universe that God's created and move along that. And so wisdom helps us to find that and keep on track. And then the Proverbs have a role of actually helping to make that concrete and practical. It's easy enough for any of us to have a grand theology or idea, and we may have read books about something and you studied it, and we said, that's how I want to be, or that's how I want to live, or that's what I want to accomplish. And yet, what we see is that we may easily lose sight of that, lose our focus. Because you need some way of making that practical, getting it down into everyday life. Just having a theoretical idea itself is not really living it out. And that really is the aim of the Christian life, isn't it? To begin to live that kind of life out. And the Proverbs are the way, in the book of Proverbs, that we can actually begin very practically, day by day, in a concentrated, focused way, begin to put into practice this faith, this wisdom that actually is consistent with the way the universe actually functions. So you might think of it in this particular way. You know, there are different kinds of physicians, not merely their specialties, but they're kind of the way they go about their work. There are the research physicians, which figure things out, right? They go and they discover new ways, new applications, or new ideas of what can be done to make our health better. But then you have like the family practice doctors that take all of that research and then very practically find a way to actually implement it. And those are two very different things. They might find that the theory itself isn't going to do any good until you find the way to apply it. And so you can think of the Proverbs in that particular way, being able to focus us. We might call it applied insight, these particular Proverbs. The focus and discipline applied to insight. And so we have, actually, when we think about Proverbs and these helpful ways of focusing ourselves and our thoughts, we actually have a lot of them in our lives. Now, when we're talking about Proverbs, I mean, plenty of people have Bible verses or other kinds of sayings on their refrigerator and things. And that can be very, very helpful to us, but there can be a misunderstanding. Sometimes people think, and there's even a whole Christian trend within Christianity of, you might call it the name it and claim it sort of idea, that you take a Bible verse and it's some promise of God and you use it almost like a magical incantation. And almost trying to, and it seems as though the purpose is to force God's hand. Instead, saying, you said this, God, therefore you need to do it because you've said it. And that really is contrary to the way God is really wanting to operate with us. Because God doesn't want us to be in a position of manipulating him, but rather cooperating with him. The idea is not to change God by using these particular verses and Proverbs. The idea is for them to change us, and we can get it very mixed up. And so, we have those on our mirror or our refrigerator. The purpose then is to have some way that we practically can begin to embrace wisdom and truth in everyday life. But again, we already have Proverbs in our life, as we'll see here in a moment. So I'm going to be throwing at you a lot of different sayings that you may have come across in your own experience. For instance, cultural-wise sayings. Here's just a handful of them. Never say never. Or cleanliness is next to godliness. Practice makes perfect. What goes around comes around. All men are created equal. Fair is fair. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. A friend in need is a friend indeed. A good man is hard to find. A house divided cannot stand. Of course, Abraham Lincoln famously quoted that from the Bible. A house is not a home. A picture paints 1,000 words, and you get the idea. There are tons of these things that are truths. Well, they all need to be weighed out for how true they may be. But again, their purpose is to remind us of particular things and get us focused in everyday life. Now, it's interesting, too, that when we look at the Bible, there's so much wisdom, and there is a lot of pithy truth in there. Some things are like, some of our readings today were kind of more big thematic things rather than something pithy. But there's plenty of that in the Bible. And there are actually phrases from the Bible that have actually moved into our cultural language for a very long time. And some people know that these are from the Bible, some people don't, because they're so familiar to us. Things like this: to fight the good fight. That's from the Bible. All these are from the Bible. A wolf in sheep's clothing. Or rise and shine. The powers that be. Go the extra mile. By the skin of your teeth. A fly in the ointment. Give up the ghost. Suffer fools gladly. The blind leading the blind. Those are all directly out of the Bible, and yet they become part of our culture. And you may have actually embraced some helpful proverbs in your own life. And it's actually worth you thinking about. I found when I was preparing this sermon and the teaching last spring when we did a Lenten study on the Proverbs, I'm trying to think of the Proverbs that I have. It was really hard to remember them. They kind of come up spontaneously in a particular situation. And without that situation, it was a little harder to dig them up. But here are some that I have, and if you've been around here at St.Francis for any length of time, you may have heard some of these. Your life is the only Bible some people will ever read. That's a proverb that I say to myself and to others all the time. If you feel far from God, guess who moved? Or I use this a ton in my own life. Hurting people hurt people. God is more concerned with your character than your comfort. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. That's actually one of the Proverbs. A cord of 3 strands cannot easily be broken. That's out of Ecclesiastes. And this one, too, you probably heard from me. I've never seen a tombstone with the epitaph, "I wish I'd spent more time at the office." You might think about your own at some time later today, if you will. But when you get to the Proverbs themselves, there are these nuggets of fantastic truth, things really worth considering. And, you may not have spent any time in the Proverbs at all, but I really recommend it. And some of them, I think are tied to particular cultural understandings of that time. There's one, for instance, spare the rod and spoil the child, that is over the centuries been taken to be a kind of excuse to really beat the snot out of our kids. And maybe that's not the best way to go about that. But nevertheless, within there's a nugget of how is it that, what is the role of loving discipline and gentle discipline in shaping our children? There's a nugget there that's worth considering. Let me just throw a few of these Proverbs out to you so you can see how wise they are, how important they can be, and how you can just sort of easily grasp these things and work them out for yourself. Here are just a few I'm going to throw at you. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever follows perverse ways will be found out. And I would add, and always looking over their shoulder. Here's one. The fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. Now, one thing to say about the Proverbs, they are generalizations. It's not always the case that someone who follows the Lord lives a long life, and then one who doesn't does a short life. But certainly by living a life of integrity and purity is more likely that we're going to have a quality of life that is superior. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but an accurate weight is a delight. A gossip goes about telling secrets, but one who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a confidence. Here's a funny one. Really rich imagery. Like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman without good sense. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but those who hate to be rebuked are stupid. Let me give you just a couple more here, but just one after the other, these fantastic sayings that are helpful. There's a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way to death. You may have heard that one before. Wealth hastily gotten will dwindle, but those who gather little by little will increase it. So you see that this pattern of really these wise sayings, and they're there in the Bible as a tool for us to help us really understand how to live life. Not as magic words, and not an incantation, but actual reminders to us to keep us on track, to help us fulfill those directions that we really want to take for ourselves. Now, we kind of talk theoretically for a little bit here, but I want to give you again a practical example of this from my own experience. Some of you, right when we shut the services down as the pandemic began to spread here in the United States the beginning of last year, one of the very first sermons that we streamed online, I told this story. And it was an episode that had happened fairly recently at that time. It's been now a year and a half or 2 years now. But I had an altercation, uninvited one, I think, with a neighbor a few houses down. I was walking my dog, and she's like me. She's limping a lot these days and as she gets more aged. And at any rate, so she likes to sniff around. And we were at this guy's yard, and he had this boxwoods that came up near the sidewalk, and she was just sniffing the corner of that. And she's never gone in this person's yard ever. Just was sniffing this. Of the 100 previous male dogs that had been by there, right? So she was just doing that. This guy, he pulls into his driveway, he's honking his horn, and he gets out and he starts screaming at me for this dog being in his yard. And he was saying something to me about curb your dog. And I grew up in the South. I never lived in a neighborhood that had sidewalks before, where I'm living now. So I thought, to me, curbing your dog is simply controlling them, and this dog's completely controlled. No issue. And then, he's yelling this and screaming at me, and I apologized, and we went on our way. I got to thinking later on, because he was talking about, this is my yard here, and that's the public part over there. And I realized that there's this whole thing that to curb your dog is you walk your dog on the side of the sidewalk nearest the curb. And the other is really the private property. So the guy was right, but it really set me off because he was just screaming and carrying on, because I grew up with an alcoholic father, and it just took me right to that, and it just really triggered a lot of stuff. So I've spent months and months and months, because I go by this guy's house all the time, driving by or walking by, and seeing him out there, and it's just all this stuff going on inside, just triggers happening. And I know, theoretically, that I need to forgive him. I need to, carry on, not carry this grudge that I'm feeling inside. And yet the theory was not really working, because every single time there was this stirring, this stuff just boiling up. And I was just, I even thought of, I want to go into the things I imagine doing, that I would never do, but I imagined doing them to his property. So at any rate, it was that bad. And so I'm thinking, I've really got to get a handle on this. I've got to really get to some place where this isn't eating me up. It's probably not hurting him too bad, but it's certainly hurting me quite a lot. And so I started thinking about the Scriptures, and are there anything there that's really going to be helpful to me? And there are a number of things, but there's one in particular, and it's not actually one of the Proverbs, but it's pithy like that. There are plenty of those in the Bible, and it's actually the words of Jesus from Matthew 5, where he says, "But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And that's a proverb that's easy enough for me to carry around. And I started, when I would get fired up and this thing would be firing off in me, I would bring that to mind. And then actually literally praying for this guy. And it's amazing how much that begins to turn those emotions almost instantaneously. It puts it in another frame. It finds that spine of the universe that God's created and gets me on that track instead of in the weeds out over here with my emotions and my history. And so there's so many practical ways that we can take these things and remind ourselves in daily life of what we want to become, and that is to become like Christ. These are intended to be helps to us to do that very thing. So I hope this discussion gives you something to think about as we all set our course to grow in wisdom, to grow like Christ. Amen.